American Cetacean Society participates in the International Whaling Commission, sending an observer to locations worldwide to monitor international laws pertaining to cetaceans. Nationally, ACS publishes the Whale Watcher Journal and the quarterly Spyhopper e-newsletter for its members. If you are a member of ACS, thank you for your support. If you are not a member, please sign up today to join us. Your annual membership dues go a long way to help protect whales, dolphins, and porpoises. The American Cetacean Society is excited to introduce Dr. Michelle Fournet's talk on humpback whale communication and the Anthropause. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused profound changes in global human behavior, including a sustained suppression or cessation of human influences on ocean ecosystems. Notably, this includes substantial decreases in marine transportation, which is a pervasive source of ocean noise. In Southeast Alaska, humpback whales have been closely researched and monitored for the past 40 years. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected the cruise industry particularly strongly. In the absence of cruise ships, underwater noise from these ships and smaller excursion boats was significantly lower, such that humpback whales may have experienced the quietest summer since the onset and continual increase of industrial tourism that began in the 1970s. For most individual whales, this was the first cruise ship-free foraging season experienced in their lifetimes. The human tragedy of the COVID-19 pandemic provides a brief, unprecedented opportunity to investigate how these whales communicate in the absence of chronic noise. Dr. Michelle Fournet is a postdoctoral researcher with the Cornell Center for Conservation Bioacoustics and the director of the Sound Science Research Collective. Dr. Fournet received her MS and Ph.D. from Oregon State University, where she investigated humpback whale non-song communication and the impact of noise on humpback whales in Southeast Alaska. More broadly, as an acoustic ecologist, Dr. Fournet uses sounds to investigate how man-made perturbations, including anthropogenic noise and climate change, alter ocean soundscapes in critical marine mammal habitats. Her current research focuses on ice seals, bowhead whales, and humpback whales in Arctic and subarctic ecosystems.
Okay, and we're back again. We'll just try. Oh, there is Michelle. We got you on there. Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
Thanks
Good evening. Good afternoon.
I know well, I can't tell anymore. Perfect. I was looking forward to this talk. This is so unusual. I thought this is amazing. And if there's any kind of strange silver lining to the pandemic, it may be just a little bit of a hiatus. So of what we're experiencing, I certainly notice it with fewer flights above my house, and I can imagine what the whales are going through.
Absolutely. And I think now is the time to look for silver linings. It might be difficult for us, but the hope is that perhaps nature is having a slightly easier go of this past year than we have been.
Indeed. We'll actually disappear here shortly. I'll let you share your screen, and I'll disappear here as soon as you get through.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Michelle Fournet. I am giving a talk for the American Cetacean Society for the January 30th, 2021 meeting. Unfortunately, my internet cut out in the middle of my talk today, and there's quite a lot of irony there, actually, given that my talk is about the Anthropause, the impact the pandemic is having on the natural world, on ocean noise in particular. So giving a talk about the pandemic only to have pandemic technology work against me. So for those of you who are watching the first half of this talk for the second time, thank you for your patience. And for the rest of you, let's talk about whales. Share some sound so I don't have to imitate any whale calls today. And here we go. So, first of all, thank you for taking the time to watch this again, and also to the organizers of the American Cetacean Society for bringing me here, for inviting me into your home, and letting me be a part of this global community. And this is particularly fitting given what I'm talking about today. You know what? Let's put some headphones in, make this easier for you.
That should improve that just a little bit. I'm an acoustician, so I think a lot about how things sound. And in this world that we're living in, I'm thinking a lot about how things sound differently today than they might have sounded a year ago or a year and a half ago. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how humpback whales are interacting with this new world, possibly benefiting from this new world, but also a little bit just about what we can learn about humpback whale communication and what we already know. So without further ado, I do want to acknowledge that the work that I'm going to talk about today was conducted on the homeland of, in Glacier Bay. Glacier Bay is the homeland of the Hoona Tlingit, and for research that was done in Juneau and the adjacent areas, that is the homeland of the Takuquan and the Aquan Tlingit clans. As most of you likely know, marine mammals have evolved to rely on sound. Sound travels much more quickly underwater than light does. It travels more efficiently underwater than light does. And as a result, it is the primary sensory modality used by marine organisms for communication. Also for foraging. Think about echolocation, how dolphins and toothed whales find their prey. Navigation, listening to acoustic cues in the environment, but also actively interacting through sound. And the properties of sound. So I'm talking about the physical properties of sound, duration, frequency, so pitch, how loud something is. These may be a response to the environment, whether or not an animal evolved a system of communication in a noisy environment, one that was filled with ice. The properties of sound can be a response to vital life functions. For example, if I'm trying to impress a mate or have a mate even detect me at all, then I need to produce a sound which is loud and potentially impressive. Similarly, sound in the underwater animal kingdom, the properties of sound are adapted to us, to how humans do things. We put a great deal of noise into the underwater environment, and in the same way as that whales and dolphins have developed adaptations to contend with ambient noise in a natural setting, they also adjust their calling behavior in response to us. And so when we measure sounds, we can look to see how these animals are interacting with their environment, each other, and with humans. And calling behavior is adaptable. Some of the more common uses or changes that we see are shifts in amplitude, animals calling louder like killer whales do when it gets noisy, shifts in pitch with an animal calling higher or lower, depending on what the ambient noise is like, and animals that are changing their call rates. So they might call more to try and increase their probability of being detected, or they might call less, waiting for changes in their environment. So for example, if a harbor seal detects a big killer whale, perhaps knowing that that is a mammal-eating killer whale, it will be less likely to call. So it will change its call rate because it doesn't want to be detected. So calling behavior is adaptable. And it's adaptable in an ecological sense, but calling behavior is also adaptable in response to us. Vessel noise in the ocean is pervasive. It is worldwide. We are everywhere at this point. And vessel noise in particular, small vessels, large vessels, is a threat to low frequency specialists like baleen whales. So I'm going to show you this chart here, and I'm just going to talk you through it a little bit. Down here on the bottom axis, our x-axis, we have pitch, and it is logarithmic, so not a linear relationship there. And then on our y-axis, we have decibels, so that's our loudness. And you can see that we have all of these different sources of sound in the ocean. And inside of this peach-colored box, you can see that we have supertankers and frigates and submarines, so human sources of noise. And then we also have whales. We have humpback whales, bowhead whales, right whales, gray whales. And those all inhabit this sort of similar pitch range, similar frequency band. But if you look at this plot, you can see that things like supertankers and frigates are much louder than a humpback whale and louder than a bowhead whale. And so what happens is our whales and our ships are in competition for acoustic space. And if we have loud vessels that are passing by, our whales might not be able to be heard above the noise. And similarly, they're inundated with that noise. And so what I've dedicated the past 10 years to is trying to understand something about what that relationship is between how humpback whales are using acoustic communication and what their response to noise is. But it's not just anthropogenic noise that animals are responding to. They're also responding to natural noise sources. So you can see here, we have this blue box that's circling rain. Rain is a major noise source in the ocean, and it inhabits that same frequency range as well. And so does the fact that baleen whales have evolved with certain natural sounds and evolved adaptations in the face of natural sounds, has that helped them to become more resilient? Have they developed strategies for contending with noise in their frequency band that can possibly be transferred? But all of that is assuming that the ocean is noisy. What if that noise stopped? That's what we've been experiencing over the past years. Globally, we've been going through what scientists have begun to refer to as the Anthropause, a period of time in human history, the first period of time in human history, where we have had this enormous cessation of travel. We have had stay-at-home orders worldwide, and it has manifested in the removal of the human interaction with the natural world at the largest scale possibly ever in human existence. Technology has enabled us to stay home in a way that we could not before, to do our jobs from home. The place that we are in our human history means that we are facing the pandemic in a very different way than we might have faced it 100 years ago. And so this cessation of human activities has both been economically tragic, not to mention the loss of human life, which is tragedy on such an enormous scale. But it does mean that there has been a shift in how we interact with the environment. And a lot of research is looking at this. So what we now know is that noise from human activity has dropped approximately 50%. That was closer to the start of the pandemic. Noise levels have gone up somewhat since then. But there was a massive drop-off in ambient noise immediately following stay-at-home orders. And this cultivated an opportunity. What does this lack of human interaction with the natural world mean for wildlife? And almost immediately, researchers began looking into this to see exactly what does this mean for the natural world. And I remember on March 13th, it was the last day that I was able to be in my lab. I haven't gone back since. We were all saying goodbye for what we thought would be about a 2-week stay-at-home quarantine. And it became abundantly clear that the field season I expected to have in 2020 in Southeast Alaska, looking at how humpback whales communicate, was going to be very different. It wasn't at all what I expected it was going to be. And a colleague of mine suggested, just because you can't go to Alaska doesn't mean your hydrophones can't. And we immediately pivoted and began looking at something else. We began looking at how quiet oceans might change humpback whale behavior. So I'm going to talk some about what we heard in Southeast Alaska this summer, and then some of the collaborations that we're forming to look at changes in behavior, changes in communication, and some of these opportunities the pandemic has given us to understand humpback whale behavior. But ultimately, behavioral ecology is essential for conservation. If we want to protect, if we want to conserve the oceans to the betterment and for the benefit of the species that we are invested in this case, humpback whales, we need to know how to do that most effectively. And to understand how to conserve the acoustic space necessary for humpback whale survival, I need to know what these calls mean. So we'll talk about that quite a bit. So let's start with foraging grounds. All the research that I'm going to describe today was done on foraging grounds, most of it in Southeast Alaska. And on foraging grounds at high latitudes, humpback whales have a very diverse acoustic repertoire. They produce late season song in fall and in winter, but most of the vocalizations they produce are called non-song vocalizations or calls. And these calls are getting increasingly more well described. They're certainly most well described for the Australian population and the migratory corridor. Other places we are building up more repertoires as time goes on. But interestingly, humpback calls are produced across age and sex. So that means that when we're listening to humpback whale calls, we're listening to male whales, female whales, juvenile whales, elderly whales, a whole smattering of what the humpback whale population looks like. And that's really important because until recently, the bulk of the research that was done into humpback whale communication was done on breeding grounds, and it was dominated by song. Humpback whale song is arguably the most listened to sound of the underwater soundscape. It was a big hit when Roger and Katie recorded Humpback Whale Song and put it on an album. Song of the Humpback Whale has been sent into space. It made it into the top 10. Big deal. Lots of people have listened to Humpback Whale Song. So much so that the voice of humpback whales in many ways became sort of the poster child for the Save the Whales movement. And I'm grateful for that. That kind of charisma changed human culture. It changed how we interact with whales. But that was quite some time, and the research continues to march forward steadily on the shoulders of the giants who began it. And what we now know is that song is sung only by male whales, presumably in a breeding context, although there is certainly more to it than just breeding. And song is really, really loud. Male whales are just screaming out song. And by contrast, calls can be quite quiet. And in Southeast Alaska, they are quite quiet. But when we study song in the tropics, we get only a subset of the population. We get only the animals that are participating in some capacity in a breeding context and are male. When we study calls, we're listening to everyone. So that's what we're going to talk about today, calls. So my job as an acoustic ecologist is to eavesdrop. I see images like the video that you're about to see, and I pair that with sounds that we record underwater. So hopefully you'll be able to hear this. Okay, I won't play the whole thing. It goes on for quite some time. But what you just heard there, hopefully, was a series of calls. We heard some swaps and some squeegees and a feeding call. And that recording was made in what you could see was this large aggregation of humpback whales. This is in Southeast Alaska and Frederick Sound. And so my job is to tease out what is the relationship between what we're seeing with all those whales at the surface and what we're hearing below it. So part of how I do that is by converting that sound into a picture. We can take sound. All sound is, when we measure sound, all we're measuring is pressure and time. That's it. Acoustics is just pressure and time. I can convert that pressure and time into pictures of sound that will give me duration, that will give me frequency, pitch, and will give me energy, more or less how loud something is. And so you can see up here, we have these 4 pictures. These are spectrograms, pictures of sound, of the 4 general classes of calls that humpback whales in Southeast Alaska make. So we went through the trouble of classifying these calls so that we could start to look for relationships between call types that are being used and call types that are heard elsewhere. It does stand to mention, however, that we have classified them, but we've classified them according to discrete human standards. This is not necessarily relevant 100% to the way the whale perceives them. And there have been lots of issues with classification in that while as humans, my inclination is to want to say this is one call type, this is another one, and this is another one, but they actually appear to occur across a gradient. Some types are very stereotyped and some types are very fuzzy. And so we can't exactly quantify how many sound types we hear, but some types are certainly discrete and some less so. And so when I was going through that classification process, there were a few things that started to pop up. Like, do all whales produce this call? Or is it just Alaskan whales that are producing this call? Or does the repertoire change over time? And so we began to investigate this concept of innateness. So to do this, here we are in Southeast Alaska. I was generously given recordings made by Dr. Roger Payne in 1976 in Frederick Sound, an area where I also do research. He and a technician sat there for just a handful of days on a small boat with a dip hydrophone listening to whales. And then similarly, I aggregated recordings made by my friend and colleague, Dr. Fred Sharp, as he was conducting bubble netting research throughout Southeast Alaska in the 1990s. And then in collaboration with the National Park Service, in particular colleague and friend Chris Gabriel, who has an acoustic monitoring program going on in the park. And then I coupled these recordings with recordings that were made by myself and my team of students in 2012 from the Five Finger Lighthouse. So we have this 4-decade spread where we recorded vocalizations in Southeast Alaska and then quantified them to see whether or not the repertoire stayed the same. Did we find the same call types over time? And ultimately what we found was, yes, that every call type was detected in at least 3 decades. But all of our call types were detected in 1976 and then again in 2012. And in particular, we found this call type. And I'm going to talk about this call type a lot today, but I'll play it for you now. That's a whoop call. This whoop call is perhaps the most common call type in the entire humpback whale repertoire. It is very, very persistent. But what we ultimately landed on looking at this persistence of calls in the repertoire between 1976 and 2012 was that this is indicative of multi-generational persistence, that there were only 250 animals in Southeast Alaska in 1976, and there were many thousands of humpbacks in Southeast Alaska in 2012. And so ultimately, given how often humpback whales reproduce, by 2012, not only could the humpback whales from 1976 still be present and calling, in fact, they're likely still present and calling today, but they also would have given birth, and then their daughters would have given birth to their granddaughters, who could have potentially given birth even to great-granddaughters. So several generations of whales were present during our recording period. So multi-generational persistence. But then we repeated this process with allopatric populations, with humpback whales that weren't genetically related at all. In fact, humpback whales that had been genetically separated by as many as 2 or 3 million years. And we took those same recordings from Dr. Payne from the 70s and Chris Gabriel in the early 2000s and compared them to a set of recordings that were made passively from Stellwagen Bank. And what we found was that there is, in fact, evidence of innateness, that we found the same call types in a completely genetically isolated population in the North Atlantic as we did in the North Pacific. We have since expanded this workout with the help of a student from the University of Manitoba. And we have determined that not only are these calls shared by the animals in Stellwagen Bank and in Alaska, but they're also shared by animals in Newfoundland and with animals in Hawaii. So generations apart and oceans away, humpback whales are producing the same suite of calls. But there is an exception. A large body of the repertoire is shared, but this call is not. This is the humpback whale feeding call. It's only been recorded in Southeast Alaska, and then more recently it has immigrated south into British Columbia. This particular call, which sounds very much like an opera singer, has been closely associated with coordinated foraging or cooperative foraging, with bubble net feeding in Southeast Alaska. And we haven't detected this call in other regions of the world, although it is also persistent over time. But that's perhaps indication that this call, unlike the other ones, is not innate. This call, it seems, might be learned. And so now that we know a little bit about what some of the calls, what the character of the call is, this call is persistent worldwide, this call is not, we can begin to dive deeper into function. And again, function is really important for conservation. If something is vital, we don't want to mask it. If something is a byproduct, perhaps the risks and rewards change. But we were able to start looking at function in the context of foraging. So this is a group of coordinated foraging whales, bubble netting whales in Southeast Alaska. And here you can see that they are feeding on Pacific herring. And so this particular behavior happens in concert with that operatic feeding call that we heard earlier when we were looking at that pile of whales in the video. And typically that feeding call occurs when we have as many as 7 or 8, sometimes even 15 or 16 animals. And the call was hypothesized potentially to coordinate individuals, because the way that bubble net feeding works, whales blow this large bubble net around a school of herring. One individual, occasionally two, will begin to produce a feeding call. They rise up towards the surface. The fish are corralled toward the surface of the water. And as soon as the call stops, the whales simultaneously open their mouth and engulf the school of fish. So the question is the call used exclusively to coordinate whales? Or is the call also used to corral the fish? Is it a prey manipulation call? Well, we were able to investigate this because in 2012, we were noticing some things. We were at the Five Finger Lighthouse in Southeast Alaska. This is Dr. Kate Indeck, who at that time was an intern of mine. And using a theodolite, we were able to take a snapshot of whale distribution in this area every 15 minutes. So we knew how many whales there were, how large the groups were that the whales were traveling in, where they were, things like that. And we coupled this with underwater acoustic behavior. So we had a two-element hydrophone array, which enabled us to get bearing, not exact location, but bearing. But we were able to map the area where our sound was coming from and overlay that on the distribution of whales in the area. And that would give us an idea, more or less, of whether or not our call was coming from a group of whales, or whether or not possibly it was coming just from a single whale. And that was what the data consistently were showing us, was that we were hearing these feeding calls when only single whales were present. Now, I'm going to show you this, and hopefully the audio will lift up.
Oh, there come more.
Oh yeah, bubble net, bubble net.
We got a net coming up.
And there's him calling. Cool. Cool.
Oh,
Woohoo! Fantastic.
Awesome. All right, hit the flute, guys.
So what you can see in that video is one whale bubble net feeding by itself. And the audio that you heard, that call, the soprano call that I mentioned, that's the actual audio that was being recorded at the time of that event. And this happened repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly, not just in our data set, but also in an anecdotal data set that we collected from other researchers in Southeast Alaska, from Jan Straley at the Sound Science Center, Chris Gabriel at Glacier Bay National Park, Fred Sharp at the Alaska Whale Foundation. And we aggregated all these observations so that we could definitively say that solitary whales were bubble net feeding. And ultimately, this enabled us to throw some confidence behind a hypothesis, which is that this little baitfish was probably listening to that sound. The best hearing sensitivity in herring is between 300 and 600 hertz. And the peak frequency for feeding calls overlaps that exactly, which means that herring, which wouldn't be able to hear a call that well if it was much higher or much lower, could both hear and respond to these calls. So we propose that, although it might be a multifunctional call, that this feeding call is a prey manipulation call, that's one of its primary functions. Now, this stands in sharp contrast to this whoop call, or the growl call, they're very similar, which is persistent over time and found in every population. So this call is shared by whales worldwide. And what we know from looking at recordings is that these whoops appear to occur in bouts of countercalling back and forth. But that happens when the whale is underwater. So unlike foraging calls where we can match surface observations, we can't actually do that with whoops because the whale is not where we can visibly watch it. But you can see here in this spectrogram, we have a whoop call, and then we have another whoop call and another one. And then at the end, we have the last one. But the structure of them is a little different. So what's likely happening here is we actually have multiple individuals that are calling back and forth. Seeing this enough led us to the hypothesis that this call is probably a contact call. But in order to figure that out, we had to design a study. So in 2019, the Sound Science Research Collective, in collaboration with UC Davis and the SETI Center, got together and we designed a study to do playbacks, acoustic playbacks to humpback whales in Southeast Alaska. And so what we did is we lived on a small island there and would take a very small vessel out into Frederick Sound. And our first step, of course, was to find the whales, and we'd photograph them so we get an idea as to who it was we were looking for. And from there, we would deploy our hydrophones. We had a 4-element hydrophone array that we would set up around the whales. And then we would turn the boat off and we would wait. And we would let the animals acclimate to our presence. Once the animals were acclimated, we would start our before period, in which we would sit there making no noise. But we would count and document the behavior of every whale in the area. So we had a bearing and a rangefinder, and from standing on our vessel, we would basically act like waterborne theodolites, and we would track where each animal was and what it was doing and what size group it was. Once our before period was done, we would repeat this exactly, only this time we would repeat it with a speaker in the water, and it would be playing one of two things. It would either be playing the sound of whoop calls at approximately once per minute for 10 minutes, or the sound of running water. And we would count the whales and document their behavior. When that period was up, we would play nothing, have an after period, we would count the whales and document the behavior. So we had this before, during, after study design with either whoop calls or a control. Now, it's important to note that the whales had to be independent. We couldn't just play the sound of the same whale over and over and over and expect that we were learning something about the population. If you watched any number of the talks today, you know that whales are individuals and their behavior is not ubiquitous. It was also important that the whales were allowed to acclimate to our presence, because vessel noise, as you'll see in just a few minutes, changes the behavior of whales. Lastly, we could only count whales that could hear us. So we had to know how far away the whales were and how loud we were. From there, we had to make sure that our stimulus was ecologically relevant, that it was as loud as a regular whale call would, and that it was set up in such a way to mimic a real whale, and also not to be dangerous to the whale or to alter its behavior in any way that is ecologically irresponsible or inconsistent. And we needed to make sure we didn't have an equipment malfunction. That's harder than it sounds when you're in a very remote area. We were playing these sounds to our speaker from an iPad, and there was definitely one moment where we inadvertently and overzealously pushed the home button on the iPad and played Siri is not available to the ocean. So that had to be scrapped and we had to start over. Similarly, all the hydrophones had to work and the playback speaker had to work. And lastly, we had to make sure the survey was complete. We couldn't have ended it early for weather, and there were plenty of times when we were out running for weather. So our audience, of course, were the whales themselves. We had 80 individual whales that were seen over the course of the study with a very low recite rate. Only 12 of those 80 individuals were seen more than once. The remaining 68 were only seen on a single day. And this was important for us because we needed to make sure that what we were dealing with was statistical independence, that, again, that we weren't just measuring one or two individuals over and over. This doesn't necessarily mean that we had limited residency, because we didn't photo ID every whale that was present. And if we came across a whale that we recognized, we would leave and go to a different area. So what did we find? The really exciting part, so we quantified how many whoops we heard and how many whales were in the area and how many whales we could possibly listen to. And what we found was that when we play a whoop call, the rate of whoop calls increases. So you can see here on the left, we have our control. In the before period, we have our call rate. The during period, we have a call rate. The after period, we have a call rate. Those are all the same statistically. There's no difference. But if you look to the right in our whoop column, you can see that we have a lower call rate in the before, and then the call rate bumps up during, and then it goes back down during the after. And this was statistically significant, indicating that there was a higher calling rate as we were calling than there was before or after. Moreover, if we compared our control to our whoop, what we saw was that in the before period, the call rates between our control and our whoop calls are the same. After period, the call rates are the same, but the during period is different. Our call rates are much higher in the during period when we play a whoop call than when we play the control. all of this to indicate that the whales called back, that we produced a contact call, and they replied with one. But the call rates in general were low. Even in the before and the during periods, you can see that when we play a whoop sound, call rates are only 1 call per whale for every 10 minutes. In the control period, calls are only 1 call per whale every 20 minutes. But Southeast Alaskan whales are not so chatty. It's not the same as if you went down to Hawaii and dropped a hydrophone and were almost guaranteed to hear whales singing if it was the breeding season. Often we were listening to nothing at all. So why does this call rate matter? It matters because there's evidence in the physical structure, in the acoustic properties of the call, that there might be individual variation in these whoop calls. That nested in these whoop calls might be a sense of voice. And so you can see how these 3 calls look pretty close. And again, maybe you have to squint, maybe you're not an acoustician, that's fine. But they don't look identical. There are definitely differences, and there are differences that we can hear. So let's see if we can. Okay, that's 1 whoop call. Now let's listen to this one. Clearly very different. And so what we did, and this was the work that was done with my student, Annie, who's just lovely, is we went through and we extracted all the salient acoustic features and ran these through several different quantitative methods, classification and regression tree, discriminant function analysis, random forest analysis. And she classified each of these by eye and by ear. And then we went through and classified them statistically and found huge overlap, which is to say that we found really strong evidence that these calls were unique, that there is in fact individual variation between the calls. And while this isn't necessarily an intentional signature, it's not like a name, it's much more akin to a sense of voice, that when you pick up the phone and talk to a loved one, you can likely recognize their voice when they say hello, and they can recognize yours. In this call, we think that there is that piece of individual recognition, which is important given that it does appear to serve a contact call function. It took all of that to get us to noise. To understand the impact of noise, you have to understand something about ecology. So now let's dive into noise and what noise looks like today. So what we wanted to know was whether or not Alaskan humpbacks were calling louder, indicating that they are resilient to noise. Are they changing their calling rates? And does it matter if the noise is wind or rain or if it's a boat? And then I wanted to know what was contributing to their acoustic habitat and how that had changed in COVID-19. So we designed a study in Glacier Bay National Park where we were looking at humpback whale calls and how they were calling to each other when there were no boats. And then we built a survey where maybe there was 1 boat and then a few more. And then we documented how the whales responded. So as we ramped up the noise and we ramped up the sources of those noise. And as we were watching from the shores, we had 4 hydrophones that were recording continuously. So we were camping on an island in a very remote location, overlooking our hydrophones in an area where there were whales. And we were looking to see what the whales were doing and how they were responding to the noise. And so once again, we used a theodolite to measure where each of these individuals were, what they were doing, and approximately how many whales were in the area at a given time. So we manually annotated all of these calls, and then we localized them. With 4 hydrophones, we could use a time difference of arrival approach to get a latitude and longitude for each call. We calculated an amplitude or a source level for each of these calls, so we could look at how loud they were when it was quiet and how loud they were when it was noisy. And then we extracted noise samples. So we took a short sample for each call and then noted whether there was a vessel present or absent. That way we could look at whether or not there were changes in how they responded to us versus how they respond to rain. And then we also looked at the acoustic habitat. How noisy was it overall? So I'm going to show you some plots. This is our ambient noise plot. It tells us green lines are our median daily noise values, and our blue lines are our 95th percentile, and then our red lines are our 5th percentile. So At the noisiest part of the day, how noisy was it? And at the quietest part of the day, how noisy was it? And you can see that we have 2015 on top and 2016 on bottom. This was a two-season project. You can see that we have this big bump starting in June and ending in August. Everything gets noisier in the month of July. And then in September, we have a lot of variability, these spikes in noise. And we wanted to know what that was from. So we generated this plot. This is one of my favorite noise plots. This is a diel noise plot. And you can see we have time on the x-axis and we have day or a month on the y-axis. Pardon me. And then the colors indicate how loud something is. So the brighter the color, the louder it is. And so you can see, just for example, we have this bright spot in the month of July, just like we saw in that diel plot. And so when we zoomed in and went and listened to some of these recordings, we discovered that that was the sound of harbor seals. Similarly, we have these two noisy periods that occur every morning about 9 and every afternoon at about 3. And wondering what that was, we discovered that that was the entrance and exit of cruise ships and small tourism vessels and pleasure crafts as they went into Glacier Bay to go see the glaciers in the morning and then returned to exit Glacier Bay in the evening. And then lastly, remember that variability we saw in the month of September? See these sort of straight lines, bright things? Storms. Our fall storms started to come in and created lots of noise. So now we have an idea as to what the major contributors to the humpback whale acoustic habitat are, and we can begin to tease out if they responded in certain ways to one noise source versus a different one. So when we looked at that relationship between how noisy the environment was and how loud the calls were, what we found was this really strong linear relationship. For every decibel increase in ambient noise, we saw about a 0.8 decibel increase in call loudness. And when we split this up between periods when vessels were present and vessels were absent, we didn't see any kind of difference. Same relationship regardless. As it got noisier in the environment, whether it was a boat, whether or not it was a harbor seal, the humpback whales would increase their calling amplitude. But what about their call rates? When we looked at the probability of detecting a call, how often a whale was calling, what we found was for every 1 decibel increase in noise, the probability of a whale calling decreased by 9%. So as it got noisier, the whales called less. But significantly, the odds of detecting a call were 33% lower when a vessel was contributing to ambient noise versus when it was just natural sounds contributing to ambient noise. The whales were responding differently to the sound of a vessel than they were to the sound of rain or wind or harbor seals. And this is a big difference. Again, about a 33% decrease in the likelihood of calling when it was a vessel that was contributing. So what does this mean? It means that in some ways, humpback whales are pretty resilient, that they're calling louder when their environment gets louder, although it's not a one-to-one relationship, which means that that communication space is probably shrinking. And it also means that humpback whales are reducing their calling effort when vessels are passing by, so they're calling less. Now, Glacier Bay is a marine protected area, and there is a certain number of boats that are allowed in at any given time, and their schedules, just by the nature of the ebb and flow of tourism, are relatively fixed. So it's possible that the whales are waiting for the vessels to pass, knowing that they'll have a moment of silence to call again. It's very difficult to say, and it's difficult to say for 2 reasons. One, we don't have an acoustic baseline. We don't know what humpback whales do when there's no vessels around at all. And 2, we haven't done this study in a super noisy environment, and partially that's because it's sometimes hard to detect the calls because it's too noisy to hear. So I haven't solved the too noisy to hear problem, but it does seem to indicate that our research doesn't point 100% to the fact that these adaptations increase resilience. It's an adaptation, but without doing a comparison of these very noise periods, these very quiet periods, what we can say is this is what's happening. But that does bring us to COVID. This is our baseline. In COVID, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we were able to put a hydrophone down in Glacier Bay We were also able to put one down in 2019, the summer before. I know there's a lot of numbers on this slide, but the basic take-home message is, in 2019, at the exact same dates in the exact same location, on average, our daily noise values were 3 times louder than in 2020 during the pandemic. Similarly, looking at these blue lines again, that the noisy period, our maximum noise levels in 2019, our daily median 99 percentile, were 25 times louder during COVID, or during our non-COVID year than they were during the pandemic. 25 times louder. So in 2020, we were able to record whales in the absence of noise. So you can see here, this is a chart that I have borrowed. I did not make this. This was work done by one of my colleagues at Cornell and Gabriel. The green is the daily noise values in 2020, and the tan are noise values in 2018, years earlier. And you can see that it is much noisier in 2018. And that there were as many as 16 vessel passages in 2018. Whereas in 2020, we don't hit those high peaks because the boats aren't coming by. So within this quieter soundscape, we were able to detect new call types. And although I myself have not done this, my colleague Chris Gabriel of the National Park Service was able to detect vocalizations of cows and calves. And interestingly, the quality of the communication seems to have shifted. Now, this is very early work. I would like to be extremely clear about that. We've only just begun this work. But from looking at a random subset of calls in 2019 versus 2020, well, I hope you could hear that. That was the sound of whales in 2020 producing pulsed calls. Lots of pulsed calls. What I was going to say before I so rudely interrupted myself with the sound of whales was that in 2020, about 38% of the calls were either pulsed calls or noisier complex calls or tonal calls, and 72% were whoops. Now remember, those whoop calls are very, very common, low frequency growly sounds. In 2019, 90% of the calls were whoops, and only 10% of the calls were pulse calls or other things, which means that in 2020, we were using a much more diverse set of sounds. And by we, I of course mean the whales. I was not there producing sounds. Now, that sound clip that you just listened to with all the it looks like this. So you can see how much acoustic activity is occurring here in 2020. And now I'm going to show you a picture of 2019. Same date, same time, just a year earlier. And you see these lines that are going across it, that's vessel noise. And what we see here are 3 small whoops, and that was all. Now again, these data are very preliminary, but it does appear that the quality of the communication may be shifting and that the complexity may have changed. So this work is ongoing. But this work was part of a larger project that we're doing in collaboration with the NOAA Southeast Fisheries Center, not with the NOAA Southeast Fisheries Center, that we're doing in collaboration with NOAA and Juneau and with the University of Alaska Southeast. I'm getting all of my things mixed up. We're working with Heidi Pearson and Susie Tierlink, and again, Chris Gabriel of the National Park Service, because in addition to recording in Glacier Bay, we also recorded in Juneau. Juneau, which is arguably whale watching capital of Southeast Alaska. And this is an area that we haven't been able to really effectively listen in the past because there's so many vessels there that we haven't been able to hear much. And the work that my colleagues, Susie and Heidi, are doing is collecting biopsies of these animals and biological samples to hopefully look at stress and changes in hormones. And we will do our best to link that back to what we're hearing in this soundscape. And so in 2020, we have an idea as to which whales were there. We did photo ID. Something about their condition, something about their biology, and a great deal about their environment. So this work, of course, will have to be followed up on in 2021. So what did we find? What we found is that calls are not sung. That within the humpback whale repertoire, there appears to be a coupled system of cultural and innate local behavior. That calls are important, even when they're not social, even when a whale is by itself. They can be used for foraging, but they're also likely used for maintaining social relationships. And calling behavior is adaptable, and this may make humpback whales more resilient to changing noise conditions, or it may not. But certainly comparing that to the data from the pandemic will help. Lastly, 2020 was a prolonged period of quiet, months instead of hours. And for whales that have been born recently, since we've seen such a large ecological rebound in the population, this is probably the quietest summer of their lives. Certainly one of the quietest summers since the onset of the Industrial Revolution, and definitely since the onset of large-scale tourism in Southeast Alaska. And this prolonged period of quiet may have altered how these animals are communicating. And ultimately, this allows us to understand baselines, document behavioral shifts, and to communicate our science. Some of the recordings that were made in 2020 in both Juneau and in Glacier Bay are beautiful. They're beautiful and they are meant to be shared. And they will be. It's an opportunity for us to listen to whales the way that whales used to listen to each other before humans started putting sound in motion. And that is a precious gift that was given to us by an otherwise enormous tragedy. So with that in mind, I know that this audience is varied. Academics, researchers, government officials, whale fans, whale watching naturalists, students, citizen scientists, docents. That entire community is important. Loving these animals is important. Understanding them is important. But it takes the whole package. Lori Marina talked a little about scholar advocacy. How do we put this information, how do we put the science to good use? And in some ways, this pandemic has given us a real opportunity to give back to these animals in the way that we weren't able to before, to be non-invasive, and then to share what their voices sound like. So this is a quote that I quite love. It says, "If you want to build a ship, don't drum up people together to collect wood, and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea." And I would add to that, to long for the endless immensity of the sea and all of the whales in it. So thank you for being with me tonight, and for listening to my talk, and for devoting your energy and effort towards the interest and conservation and knowledge of these animals.
Okay, so we got a few questions that I wanted to answer about what's going on with humpback whales. So one of the questions was, does song occur only on breeding grounds, or can it be heard during migration or feeding? That's a great question. So although song is predominantly heard on breeding grounds, we hear it there near constantly. So if you were to drop hydrophone in Hawaii in late February, for example, in almost 24 hours of the day, you'd hear song. But we do hear song elsewhere. So, and the more we study song globally, the more that we understand that it's not just restricted to the tropics and subtropics. So we hear song along migratory corridors fairly commonly. We also hear late season song on foraging grounds. So in Southeast Alaska, where I do my work, we hear songs starting at about September, and it will go through October and November, and sometimes as late as December. And we do have some whales that will overwinter there. So yes, song can be heard throughout the migration for humpbacks. All right, another question was, do calls vary according to the season other than mating calls? Oh, that's a great question. The answer is kind of. There's a lot of room for research here. We haven't looked at this, or I haven't looked at this specifically, but what we do know is that calls are socially specific. So they reflect different social contexts, they reflect different behavioral contexts. So in Alaska, you might hear humpback whales that are cooperatively foraging, producing feeding calls, that sort of long operatic call. You're not going to hear that sound being produced in the wintertime in Hawaii. There's no herring there to forage on. So in that regard, there are some seasonal separation between calling behavior. And then similarly, on breeding grounds, when we have large aggregations of male whales that are actively competing for access to a female, they might produce sounds that indicate higher states of arousal that we might not see when animals are foraging by themselves with lots of food around. So I would say that technically, yes, there is seasonal separation, but really it has more to do with the social and behavioral context. All right, next question. Has anyone played humpback whale feeding calls for herring in the lab? Yes, they have. And in fact, I believe that there's still some of this work ongoing right now. Dr. Fred Sharp, as part of his dissertation, played feeding calls to herring. And what he found was that they had an anti-predator response, a clump and flee response. And I believe that there are some other researchers in Alaska who've done this as well. But yes, herring respond very strongly to the sound of feeding calls in the lab. Next question. Am I familiar with ongoing research recordings, acoustic recordings in the South Pacific? Is it of interest to compare between populations this far apart? Yes, it's very interesting to compare populations this far apart. And yes, there are several groups that are recording in the South Pacific. Plenty of them are recording song, but they'll be recording non-song vocalizations or social calls as well. I have not yet collaborated with folks down there to do a direct comparison, although we do have a global network of folks that study social sounds, and we get together and compare what we're working on. So we're trying to develop that global catalog. But yes, as far as I'm concerned, understanding the foundations of humpback whale language require us to look at this question globally. So looking at the South Pacific would be great. And then the last question I got was how this Antropause compares to the days immediately following 9/11. Oh, that's a great question. So I would say that what we're experiencing in the Antropause is a protracted version of what happened during 9/11. So following 9/11, we had these, I think it was 3 days where the Eastern Seaboard was closed down, and it was really quiet. And it was an immediate stop. Now, that hard stop didn't happen during the Anthropause. We had the cessation of cruise ships and tourism vessels in some areas, but in other areas, we had more people going out on small boats. So if you look down in Florida, for example, there's some anecdotal evidence that as people were given stay-at-home orders, that they went out fishing. So what we're seeing, at least in Alaska during the Anthropause, is this many month long period of protracted quiet. And so that means that the animals have a long time to adapt and adjust their behavior. So we would certainly expect to see some of the same responses during the pandemic that we saw after 9/11. But what's really remarkable about studying this now is that long time period, that protracted pause that allows animals to potentially reacclimate to a pre-industrial behavior. Okay, I think that those are all the questions that you had for me. And thanks again for including me in this process, and speak to you soon.